I'm going to present first a project I've been working on during the last 3 years, which is a project on education of migrant children and youth, and we have mainly worked with immigrant population. The policy framework in which the project is inserted is the Inter-American Program for the Promotion and Protection of the Human Rights of Migrants, and the Inter-American Program on Education for Democratic Values and Practices that the Office of Education and Culture is developing. The objective of our project was to document, systematize, and promote lessons learned from successful policies, programs, and practices geared towards providing quality educational experiences to migrant children and youth. And we expect it to increase knowledge and capacities within ministries of education and other educational agencies to develop, implement, and evaluate programs to improve educational opportunities for these populations. The beneficiaries were mainly the migrant children, and we have worked with all the OAS member states. In the first year, we developed a mapping of public policy and programs at the national level. Here, we first made a literature review about the education of migrant children and youth in the region. Then we sent a survey to the ministries of education of all OAS countries, and this survey was answered by 23 countries, and we also then systematized this information and wrote an analytical report about policies and programs. Stage two was aimed at developing case studies. The idea in the first place was to develop case studies on successful programs and policies for immigrants. But since we didn't find as many programs or as many practices as we expected, we switched the focus of the case studies and studied the needs and the demands of the immigrant people. And for that, we visited schools in 3 selected countries, and we did surveys and interviews to key actors, to students, to parents, and to teachers, and also to the ministries of education. Then we developed country reports, and we are working now in the design of an analytical report about the demand for education for immigrant children and some ongoing practices we did find in the country. The third phase was this year, when we developed a workshop on May 25 and 26, where people from the ministries of education of the involved countries came to discuss what was going on in their countries, and they identified some challenges and made recommendations for public policy. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first stage, about the mapping of public policy. 1 second. The survey the countries answered, they said that 9 countries had no policy or program that was geared towards migrant children and youth. 7 countries said that even though they didn't have any policies, they did have activities or programs that included migrant populations. Many of these programs also benefited other types of vulnerable populations. For example, indigenous people or children that were at risk of dropping out of school, persons with disabilities, etc. And then 7 countries answered that they did have an education policy in place for migrant children and youth. However, not always these policies had institutions or budgets or a specific law to develop this policy. And when we analyzed the surveys, we found out that there are specific needs that immigrant children have at school. For example, language issues, cultural integration, uprooting from the country of origin, family separation, and gender reunification, interruption in their studies, as well as the recognition of educational certificates. These problems are aggravated in the case the children and their families are poor. So it is not just a matter that they have a different nationality, but also that they live in conditions of poverty. And so they also share problems that poor people have in general. The lack of accurate and up-to-date data on migrants suggests that the issue of education of migrant children and youth is not a high priority on the region's public agenda. When we asked about the achievements the programs and policies had, they answered with many actions for international cooperation. For example, some countries exchange methodologies and information, and these countries usually share a border. For example, Bolivia and Argentina, United States and Mexico, and Colombia with Venezuela and Ecuador. When we asked about the problems these programs and policies had, the main problem was the ability to measure and assess the population of immigrant students in the countries and in the schools, so to better define policies and programs. Okay. As I said, phase 2, which was developed last year, was about developing 3 case studies. We thought that, as I said, we didn't want to study policies and programs, and we would rather focus on immigrant children and their families. So despite the increase of migrants in countries of the continent and with the expected increase in diversity of nationalities and cultures in the classroom, this phenomenon hasn't been matched by a commensurate interest in public education policy regarding migrant students in education in most countries. So we work with the hypothesis that there is a potential demand for migrant families to have programs and policies that focus on the education of their children. So at first we thought that we would develop case studies in 4 countries of the region, but then we only developed it in 3. Our case studies were in Costa Rica, in Argentina, and in Antigua and Barbuda. The 4th country was going to be the US, but we couldn't find a state or a partner to develop our case study. In Argentina, I went in August 2010. I visited 4 schools, and we made 92 surveys, 19 interviews with students, 6 surveys, 6 interviews, and 1 visit to a neighborhood. 6 surveys and 16 interviews to parents, and we also visited a neighborhood, and then there we talked to a family and to a social organization that was working in that neighborhood. We did 2 focus groups, 3 interviews with teachers, and 4 interviews with principals. And we interviewed the coordinator of the intercultural bilingual education modality. In Costa Rica, we visited 3 schools and did 55 surveys, 1 focus group, and 13 interviews with students, 5 surveys and 5 interviews to parents, 2 focus groups with teachers, and 1 interview with the director of the Office of Education and Intercultural Affairs. And in Antigua and Barbuda, we visited 4 schools, did 68 surveys and 27 interviews to students, 8 surveys and interviews to parents, 1 focus group with teachers, and an interview with the Director of Education in the Ministry of Education. So the UN estimates that there are 50,042,000 immigrants in North America and 7.5 million immigrants in Latin America and the Caribbean. And specifically in these countries, we have 1.5 million immigrants in Argentina, around 500,000 immigrants in Costa Rica, and 21,000 immigrants in Antigua and Barbuda. But if we see the percentage of immigrants of total population, we see that in Argentina it's just 3.6%, in Costa Rica 10.5%, but in Antigua and Barbuda at least it's 23.6% of total population. We found out in the schools we visited and the families and parents and students we met that in all 3 cases, migration comes from neighboring or nearby countries. In Argentina and Costa Rica, there is a strong presence of people of indigenous origins. In Costa Rica, immigrants are mainly from Nicaragua, and in Argentina, they are mostly from Bolivia, Paraguay, and Peru. In Antigua and Barbuda, they mainly come from Dominica, Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Jamaica. As I said, we interviewed the parents. They say their main reason for migration is employment. And they are involved in specific areas of the labor market. They work in seasonal activities, domestic service, construction, and trade. Specifically in Antigua, their work is related with tourism. Access to better education is presented as a desire to improve living conditions, but the urgency and need for a job may be a cause of dropout. The parents said that some of them migrated because they wanted to continue studying or because they wanted to go to school, but then they didn't have any money, so they needed to start working, and they dropped out of school. Another thing with parents is that family reunification serves as a route to the new country for different family members. Migration has a long history, and these families may not be the first family that goes to that country. So they usually know someone in the host country, either it's a relative or a friend or people they know. So they go to the host country and then they bring their kind of job, and then they bring their children or go back to their home country and bring them to the new country. So what did the students say? They said some of them had gone to school in the country of origin, but the majority of them started school in the host country, in the new country. As you see, only 32% in Antigua, 11% in Costa Rica, and 37% in Argentina had attended school in the country of origin.